Those who want to stay and ask questions, just raise your hand. I'll recognize you. If at some point there are too many hands going up, I'll ask Greg to kind of keep track of who raised their hand first. But barring that, I'll just handle it. Field questions from the floor. All right, way back in the corner. And could you say your at least your first name? Mike. Ah, right. So some physicists, his question was, what's the difference between a philosophical and a merely empirical multiverse picture? So some physicists really do take seriously this idea of a multiverse, that our universe might have been, here's one way they think. There are different models for how they might think about this. Here's one way. They might say, before the Big Bang, right? The Big Bang itself is a product of some primordial condition that's deeper, right? Some high energy field that's a vacuum. It doesn't contain any matter, but it's highly unstable, and so it kind of, subtle imbalances, perturbances cause it to kick off, generate, universes spawn, and so ours is just one of these bubbles off of this primordial thing. Physicists who kind of are attracted to that idea very misleadingly, say, see, you can get something from nothing, right? But what they mean by nothing is just no matter, no particular matter. There's a Lawrence Krauss as a physicist who's writing a book, and science, philosophy's all bunk. We've answered this fundamental physical question. We do it through good, hard science. And he's just confused, right? Because what they're talking about is not nothing. It's a something. It's something. It's an energy field. It's got potential, right? So that would be a view, right? And there's certain kinds of reasons why they're attracted to that view. Some cosmologists, I'll just let you know, absolutely hate this. They say this is trying to turn physics into philosophy. Right? I actually went to a conference in cosmologists, right, debating about this, and there were people standing up literally shaking their finger, their whole body trembling, getting angry, right? Because the more empirically minded folks say, we can't observe any of this stuff, right? Science is got to be rooted in observation. And if this picture is right, no matter what our universe is like, is equally consistent with this hypothesis. So it's not sensitive to the particular details of the way our universe. Okay, just wanted to let you know that. But still, it's an idea. Theorists like to play around with these models, and they can get very sophisticated mathematical models for how that could be so. But that says nothing about whether reality had to be constituted by this kind of multiverse, right? It's because science doesn't say things like that things have to be. So science says conditional things about, given that things were this way up till now, it might have to go, unfold in a certain way. But that reality is this way altogether, that's not part of the empirical theory. The empirical theory is just descriptive. Here's how things are. It's a hypothesis. There is this universe-generating field, right? And there's ever so many bubble universes bubbling off this, and we just happen to inhabit one of them, okay? That's the empirical theory. A philosopher might come along and say, but I really want this theory to be totally complete, right? And so I'm going to posit that there's something about the nature of the totality, or maybe the primordial thing that generates all these bubble universes. There's something about it such that it absolutely has to be, right? We don't have a good handle on why that's so. We can't sort of see its necessity, right? But we're going to posit that it's true of it. Okay? So it's a gloss on the empirical theory. It's adding this property of necessary existence. Okay, well, no. David Lewis, I don't. So David Lewis famously is a philosopher who died, sadly, about 10 years ago. Brilliant, but crazy. Absolutely crazy philosopher, but absolutely brilliant. Terrifyingly brilliant guy. But he wanted to posit that there is a non-denumerable infinity of universes, but not for any empirical reasons.
Right, that's what I'm trying to...
But also not to answer my question either, though.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to...
He's trying to analyze what we mean by... So he says there's all these universes. What do we mean when we say reality could have been otherwise? Lewis's answer, we mean that there is another world that's like that. Right? And that's a very strange way of thinking about possibility, right? right? And usually, you say, look, here's the way reality is. I don't think I'm a roofer, right? But I think I could have been, right? But that's not the way it is. I'm not a roofer, right? Lewis says, right, you're not a roofer in this world, but there's someone a lot like you in another world, in a world that's really a lot like this world, right? Someone who's, who counts as you, who and is a roofer. He follows the roofer's path, right? And that's what makes it true that you could have been a roofer. And you might say, well, even if there are these other universes with guys a lot like me, kind of weird thought, but that they're roofers, that doesn't say anything about, why is there me in this world existing as a philosopher, right? But Lewis will say, well, you just don't understand. I'm giving you a reductive account of what possibility and necessity, these features of possibility and necessity consist in. Talk about possibility is just to talk about existing universes. Okay, so it's a different project, but you're right. He's got this, so it's a totally differently motivated project, and yeah, it's a really fun. You should read his book on the plurality of worlds. It's a great piece of philosophy, even though it's just about absolutely everything that's said in there is false. Yeah.
This is a really interesting talk. I really liked it, and I probably go more into this in your book, Theism.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Because if you have, say, this big bubbly multiverse thing, and God, there's some necessary being by some kind of libertarian choice instantiates that, it seems to be kind of like a deistic type of explanation.
Why?
Of why our world would emerge as just one among many. It would just sort of work like a kind of clockwork. Like
okay.
Anything kind of special about us or something like that. I guess I just wanted to know if I'm misunderstanding you.
Okay, right. So a theistic view of reality. Christians were theists, not deists, and part of what that means is that God he didn't just sort of spark the beginning of the universe and then stand back and watch the show with no involvement, right? That would be classical deism, right? And popular in the 17th, 18th century among some thinkers, partly motivated by the problem of evil and talk of the miraculous as superstitious and so forth, but they're impressed by the seeming order and beauty and arrangement of the world, thinking there had to be an intelligent being behind it all. So they think there's a divine being that just generates this world and is kind of maybe aware of it, maybe not, but it can't interact with it, right? Whereas theism says God creates the world and sustains it moment by moment, right? Reality, contingent reality, we don't just sort of exist on our own steam, right? If God were to stop actively willing the universe into being, it would just cease to be, in the way that if a dreamer wakes up from a dream, the dream vanishes, right? It's utterly dependent through its whole existence on the continuous causal activity of God. So that's one thing a theist says as opposed to a deist. And further, Christian theists think that God doesn't just create a world that unfolds in accordance with natural causal processes, but God has also revealed himself, sometimes in miraculous ways in the world, right? And of course in the incarnation, God becomes part, shockingly, of the created reality itself. So all of that is consistent, I think, with this kind of philosophical way of thinking about God, on which God he exists of absolute necessity. In fact, I think there are good theological. So if you go to Richard Swinburne's talk tomorrow, what he's going to say is absolutely false. I just want to let you know. It really is. He's just wrong about, even though he's really, he too, he's one of the greatest Christian philosophers of the 20th century. But he's wrong in the way he thinks. He says, no, God doesn't exist of necessity. But look, if God doesn't exist of absolute necessity, then he'll still say, of course, that God doesn't depend on anything. He just, but he'll say it might have been that there was no God. There's no contradiction. There's no necessity that God exists. But if that's so, then it would seem like God could think to himself, I'm glad that I exist. It might, if it's true that I might not have been, then God has that thought. He knows that fact, right? And so he could feel fortunate that he exists in the way that you and I feel. And that's just an unworthy thought, right? To think that God could have that thought. That's part of why thinking for God to be God, he would have to be utterly, his very being couldn't even be subject to the vagaries of chance possibilities, right? There has to be no possibility that God not have existed. So I think there's theological reason just from the very idea of God. That's not an argument that God exists, right? So an atheist could agree that, right, if there is a God, God must exist of absolute necessity, and then deny that. So this is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Anselm, right? They can fit together, right? Yeah.
So we start out asking there be a theory of everything. Go to your talk and we say, the basic question. This is the question we have to be asking because it meets these criteria.
Right.
And then so we start looking at some possible. We go with the schema and approach. We start filling in, especially as theists and Christians. We say, well, can we use that as a rudder to start filling in the schema?
Yeah.
Okay. And so we end up with this being that's a necessary being, and that's why it's a really good fundamental principle, or the answer is gives a better answer than maybe some equation or whatever.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so here's my question. We have this kind of explanation that's circular or doesn't go on, or it's brute, if at all, with a small being on it.
Okay.
But it's existence. But
right.
This being has attributes.
Yeah.
So, am I missing something when I ask, well, why are this? So we have this reason why it is. It's necessary.
But why
is it?
Good. Right. Excellent. I want to say one thing prior to directly answering that question, which is just that don't think of this kind of metaphysical style explanation schema, whether theistic or otherwise, as a rival to any ongoing physical theorizing. It's intended to be complementary, right? It's saying here's an explanation that picks up where science leaves off. It's going to something that's more fundamental, but it's not a rival, right? As Thomas Aquinas, great Christian philosopher, says, we think of God as the cause of causes, right? It's not a rival kind of cause too. It's not saying physics is bunk, go with God, not physics. No, it's saying physics goes so far, right? But it can't. We can see that there's a kind of explanatory need that is not getting met in principle by physics, not just by where it's been. Okay, but then you ask a good question. You say, well, so if God is a necessary being, and God is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, and maybe there are infinitely many other attributes we haven't even contemplated, right, that we don't know about God. Why is it? Whoa. Sorry about that. Why is it that that's true of the necessary reality? Why is it like that as opposed to some other way? And the short answer is going to have to be, well, it's necessarily that way. That is, there can't be any brute facts about God's nature, right? Because then we would say, well, what's the explanation? If God could have been all-powerful but isn't, or vice versa, right? Well, then what accounts for the fact, the way the necessary being actually is? Now, we might not be able to show that that's so. That is, we might not be able to see why perfect goodness and perfect power inevitably go together. Although, I think interestingly, you can give some partial arguments, and actually Richard Swinburne has done some of this in an interesting kind of way. So here's one way to show at least certain divine attributes seem to inevitably go together. So if God is all-powerful, claim God would have to be all-knowing. Why? You say, why couldn't just a pure power be an unknowing thing? Well, because to be all-powerful would be to be capable of generating any of a range of possibilities, right? But to be capable of generating any of a range of possibilities, you have to be in a position to grasp those possibilities, right? You think about a blind, powerful, thing that it just does its thing. the sun, it's just kicking off its energy, right? It just does its sort of thing. It's a very powerful system in our universe, right? But it's not a possibility for the sun, say, to make a cup of coffee, right? It's not that kind of thing. It just does its thing in a really powerful way, right? So to be all powerful would be able to do this or this or this or this or this, right? And to kind of wield that power, it seems like you have to be aware of these possibilities and to be able to select from among them. So it seems like to be really all powerful requires knowledge. Now that's just one link, right? And then the thought would be, it's got to be that somehow all the attributes of God are mutually entailing, right? That if you fully grasp them and could really understand them for what they are, you would see that they inevitably go together. They form a complete, a unified whole. Now, in fact, I mean, the medieval philosophers who thought about this a lot, for just this kind of reason, they said that God is metaphysically simple. That is, that God doesn't really have a multiplicity of attributes. God is just God, right? And talk of God's power and knowledge, these are just different ways of referring to the reality which is God that doesn't really have differentiation. We have to talk as if God has all these different properties because that's the way we make sense out of things. We analyze and see relationship. That's a result of our limited way of knowing, right? But God would have to be a metaphysically simple being. Why? Well, because if he had any kind of structure, then we could ask this kind of question. Well, why does this part go with this part? And it looks like we've introduced some contingency. But God is the ultimate buck stopper, right? The buck stops with God, right? And there can't be any contingency in his nature, so he's got to be simple. Now, I think that leads to problems. And of course, they were aware, and they heroically tried to overcome these problems. It's amazing for a Christian philosopher like Augustine and Anselm and Aquinas and all the rest in this era. They all embraced this doctrine of simplicity. You say, well, wait a minute. We're Christians. We believe God is triune. That looks like some structure, right? And they wanted to say, well, actually, that's consistent with what we're saying. And I myself, I have doubts about whether they succeeded in showing the consistency. It sure doesn't look consistent on the face of it, right? But so absolute unity is just the limit case of the idea of attributes that are mutually entailing without collapsing into being the self-same attribute. That's how I would preserve. So a commitment of the explanation schema is there's got to be something about the nature of this thing such that there's no loose ends within its own nature, right? It is the way it is, not just that it exists, but it is the way that it is of necessity. We might not be able to, here's one more way, we might not be able to fill out the schema, right? We might be able to do a little bit, and show certain links between certain divine attributes, but others might be completely opaque to us. That's okay. That just means we're not in a position to really fully spell out the explanation. But if we could come to have reason to think this is the best, just given the limited partial nature of the hypothesis that we're able to come up with, it does a better job of explaining contingency than any alternatives we could conceive. We could still have reason for thinking this is the right way to go. That's my idea, at any rate. By the way, the book that I wrote, there was a nice little book symposium in a journal that's edited right here called Philosophia Christi, and I give a little précis of the book, right? Some like 8 pages or something, and then you can just get a beautifully uncomplicated overview of the book, and then maybe not even have to read the book. You can read some criticisms by some other philosophers, my replies, and the whole thing's done in 40 pages. Call it a day. So that's a recommendation if you want to see the basic structure of things. Questions? You first.
This is off topic, but it parallels. I was introduced to you by your agent causation article in Oxford.
Okay.
And I want to know if your view of agent causation against event causation ties into the very basic question with contingency. Meaning, if it was event causal, could it be this deterministic chain of the sequence going back to God? And I try to grapple with this because I'm a theist. I believe in God. And then there's Christian theists that believe in event causation, and then there's Christian theists that believe in agent causation. Does one way or another change an assumption on your basic question?
I don't think it changes any assumptions on the question. I'm trying to be mindful of, I'm thinking a certain chunk of people. I know what you're asking, but I'm worried that about half the audience has no clue what you're talking about, just because it's depending on their background. But yeah, theories of causation, whether we should think of causal links as one state of things giving rise to another state and so forth, that would be kind of chains of events, right? Certainly a tempting natural way to think about how the world, the physical world operates, right? Things being this way usher into things being that way. That is the state or event of, the particles being charged, in this context causes, the repulsion of the other similarly charged particle, which causes blah, blah, blah. And it's kind of a flow of events way of thinking about how the world dynamically unfolds. And then the idea of agent causation is the idea that a thing as a substance causes, not the current temporary state of the thing, but the thing itself, right, causes, perhaps in a purposive way, if we're thinking of agent causation.
It's got to be this world out of necessity.
Yeah.
If you have,
I see what's happening in the amplifier.
Event causation, maybe where it has to go a certain way, but maybe an agent causation is considered no, because God's a substance and he's not bound by these events. I didn't know if I was off track, assuming that he could have been thinking that way.
Yeah, no, I think what was motivating Leibniz was just the idea that, well, two things. He thought the principle of sufficient reason was one of the absolute bedrock principles of making reality intelligible. It goes that deep for Leibniz. It's just obvious. It's like the law of non-contradiction, the contradictory states of affairs, right? This is this great principle, right? And law of non-contradiction is a great principle. And he thought, given these two principles, we can do, he was a brilliant mathematician, as well as being, really knowledgeable about physics. He was a very accomplished engineer. He was a diplomat. He had like 12 careers. The guy was an absolute genius, right? He might have been the greatest philosopher of all time. And he didn't do philosophy professionally. It was just stuff he did on the side, kind of for fun. He was just absolutely brilliant. But yeah, so like a lot of mathematicians, he's looking for a few principles, that you can then generate, just like set up a few basic axioms. You want them to be as transparent and obvious as possible, and then be able to generate theorem after theorem out of that. That's his beautiful kind of approach, and he wanted to do that in philosophy, and the principle of sufficient reason was one of his principles, and it's got to apply to God too, right? So it's got to be that when God operates, when God acts, there's always a reason why he does this rather than that. Otherwise, it would just be arbitrary. And Leibniz was horrified by the idea that God would just arbitrarily choose this over that. There has to be some deep explanation. But now, it's not a kind of necessity like the necessity governing the way the sun unfolds. It's not a choiceless necessity, right? He called it a moral necessity. No, God inevitably chooses this because he sees that this is the best of all possible worlds, and he desires to create the best of all possible. So it's not like there's this inner compulsion just pushing God that way. It's just God's perfectly rational, perfectly wise. He's oriented to the best. So boom, here's the best. I survey all the possibilities. I see that this is on the top of the heap, right? All the possibilities are ordered. This is the best one. Well, obviously I'll go for that. I think Leibniz is right. If there is a best possible created reality, it's hard to resist the idea. It's really hard to conceive God not choosing it, right? He says, oh, I'll go, a Googleplex, level high of goodness, really good, I've got a Googleplex, right? That's one followed by 100 zeros, I think. This world's got one Googleplex SGU, standard goodness units, right? Whatever those are, okay? Great, really good world, really, really good world. I'll grab that, but wait a minute, that world's got 500 Googleplex SGUs, and then finally, here's the one that's got the greatest number of SGUs of all. Why would I go for this one rather than, it's kind of hard to think of God just now this is kind of getting back to your worry a little bit about the deism, because, and there's a nice article by Christian philosopher Robert Adams addressing this kind of question, and he said, well, look, central to the Christian way of thinking about God is that God's not the utility maximizer, of some philosophers, right? God is a personal being, and he might just have an affection for, right? God can love even things that are less than perfect, like you or me, right? So he can have an affection towards creating somewhat, you know, kind of sometimes miserable creatures like ourselves, and that's grace. And to be able to extend grace, to give reality to beings like that are far, far from the best, right, that he might have created, is a manifestation of an aspect of the character of God. So there's a lot to be said about this issue. But I kind of want to go with as far as Leibniz is saying, God's not just going to arbitrarily go for some, because it's, you know, I might have a weird affection for a mangy dog, right, that's far from being the best kind of dog. Because human beings are quirky that way. We have our idiosyncrasies and so forth. But I find it kind of weird to think of God being like that, having this idiosyncratic kind of, I don't know, there's something about these human beings that are kind of cool. And yeah, there are these much, much better beings, but forget about those. I'll just go with these mangy human beings, right? And there's no best possible world, right? My way of thinking about this is in the book, by the way, is saying, well, if there's no limit to the number of different ways God might have created reality, and there's no upper limit, no best, then now it looks like God's in a kind of weird bind. No matter how high he reaches, he doesn't get any closer to the top, right? Because there is no top, it's infinite, right? But there is a way out of the problem. The problem is if you think of God as creating only one universe, one totality. But if God were to create all universes above some minimum threshold of goodness, the whole infinite hierarchy of possibilities, then he's never had to settle. He allows the mangy things like us to exist, right? But he doesn't forsake the even better still things. Or maybe he does every 10th one, or every 20th one, or every Googleplex one. It's still going to be the same number of universes. Right? So now perhaps we do. Now we've got a theistic reading, just kind of reflection, philosophical reflection on theism that might lead us to think that there is, after all, a multiverse. I actually incline to think that this is so. In fact, I'm thinking about trying to write a paper with a student of mine saying, well, what do we think about the incarnation if this is so? Because, wow, if we've got an infinity of universes, presumably some of them have rational, moral beings like ourselves. And if some of them do, if you know anything about infinity, you know quickly that means there's an infinite number of them that are like this, right? And yeah, well, maybe some of these worlds aren't fallen worlds. Presumably, if there's one, there's infinitely many. Do we have to have God the Son being incarnate in multiple universes? Is that even coherent, right? Could God assume more than one created nature? I'm thinking about this. Anyways, I'm not going to, it's kind of fun to think about, but philosophy is fun once you get going, you know? One question leads to another, and all right, any other, yeah.
Hopefully I can ask this correctly, but so I'm thinking, this is really cool, by the way. Really neat.
Thanks.
So I'm thinking about your questions and contingency and everything else. So I'm thinking about impossibility, and then I'm thinking about what's not possible.
Okay, right.
Finding by what's possible.
Right.
So then in trying to flesh that out, it seems I have two routes available. One is to say that it's a virtue of, so if we have this necessary being, virtue of God's powers, of what's possible, so what he can create. So that just kind of is like bound impossibility. But then the other route would be like some sort of principles that would define what's possible and what's not possible.
Yeah.
And so the powers route seems to suggest that in that case.
Are you an engineer or a mathematician?
I'm actually EK.
Okay.
The engineer's K.
Okay. You're kind of thinking like an engineer here. Okay, good.
So it seems that if you have powers route, then that makes God contingent in some way.
Right.
It seems like so he could have made more powerful or less powerful. At least I'm not sure how to think about that. So bear with me. And the other route, we end up with these like principles binding God's powers. And I'm not sure if that violates, or if that's like the wrong kind of belief.
Right.
And so my question is, like, help me think about that.
All right. If I was following you carefully enough, because I did what philosophers sometimes do. Something you said early on, I started part of my mind started wandering. So I hope I didn't wander off too far, and so I missed something crucial. But is the worry something like this? If there are these principles that inevitably structure the way God chooses or something like that, then that sounds like there's something outside of God that God's constrained by. Is that the worry or part of the worry?
Well, I think it's because you talked about two kinds of brute, like one that's kind of like, this is just
brute capital B, yeah.
Yeah, and then you have this other kind that's okay, which is brute, but we don't need it. It's the type of brute that doesn't need reasons.
Right. Or there's a reason why. There is a brute fact of that sort.
Sure.
Yeah. So it's kind of indirectly it's not brute or something like that, because there's an explanation of why there is a brute fact like that.
So
just not an explanation of that brute fact per se. Yeah.
So the outside principles, which would that, is there a problem there with would that be like the bad kind of brute, or was that even brute even the right word for that?
So the thought is that once you go down this garden path, thinking about contingency and contemplating necessity, and once you've find yourself opting for the idea that there's a transcendent cause which is necessary, right? Then it's going to turn out to be, depending on what the nature of that thing is, that's going to determine what kinds of explanation are possibly available. And you might say, that looks kind of brute or chancy, because we've got a necessary being like this, that operates non-deterministically. We get these kinds of explanations, but not these kind, not the contrastive kind, why A rather than B. Had it been a mechanistic, deterministic kind of necessary being, then we would have, in addition to YA type explanations, we'd have YA rather than B type explanations as well. And you might think there's something brute going on here. But that's only because, it's natural to worry about that. But I think if you think about it, you're thinking wrongly about necessary. You need to just really think about. Look, if there really is a necessary being of this sort, and not one of the pure necessity, necessary being generating necessarily the product that it does. I'll call it a mechanistic, deterministic, mechanistic kind of necessary being. If there's not a necessary being like that, then there couldn't have been one, right? That's the great thing about necessity, right? If it's not actual, it's not even so much as possible, right? So it's possible, epistemically, that is, we can because we don't see through to the just transparently see the inner necessity of God's nature and that God is the way he is. It can look like it's possible, for all we know, with certainty, for all we can see into it, that there could have been a necessary being like that. But it turns out, no, actually, there couldn't have been. If we really understood the way reality is, that becomes a fantasy, right? The reality couldn't have even been like that. There's a really nice place in C.S. Lewis where he's talking about God and morality, right? He imagines, it must be in The Problem of Pain, because he's talking, it's an early chapter called Goodness, I think. And Lewis says, look, all right, the skeptic says, why in the world would a perfectly good God allow the world with the kind of absolutely horrific suffering that sometimes occurs in our world, right? Because after all, a perfectly good God would want us to be as happy as possible. If we lived in a world created by and sustained by a perfectly good God, it would just be an endless party, and you never would get, tired and worn out. It would just be fantastic all the time. And Lewis says, but that's conceiving of the goodness for human beings in a certain way that actually depends on atheism. Yes, if there is no God, then presumably the intrinsic goodness, the highest good given human nature, is to feel fulfilled, to have projects that you find challenging and fulfilling, having great relationships, that you draw comfort from, ordinary creaturely comforts of various kinds. That would be the highest good, the best kind of life, the good life, as people often say, right? But if theism is true, then we are essentially dependent on God, and we're made for relationship with God. And that is foundational to the good for human beings. And if theism is true, God necessarily exists that way. And we are necessarily, if we exist, inevitably that would be our good. All of created reality is oriented toward the perfect good, which, if theism is true, is God, right? So this alternative way of thinking about human goodness, which seems perfectly conceivable, we all, even Christians, right, we can feel the pull of it, and sometimes, you know, we inhabit the mindset where that's all we're pursuing, turns out to be, he says, an atheistic fantasy, right? It depends on the assumption of atheism, right? But if theism is true, atheism is not even so much as possibly true. So if theism is true, it's not even possible for there to be creatures whose good consists solely in creaturely pleasure. All right, so that was a bit of an aside, but I he does a beautiful job of talking about that. So if you're asking the problem of evil, you have to conditionally adopt the theist mindset, right? And say, okay, I'm going to conditionally suppose God exists and is the fount of all reality and has created human beings to be ultimately in union with him. And then I'm going to ask myself whether I can make sense out of that kind of God, with that aim in mind for human beings, could choose to permit sometimes really intense, horrific suffering in some of his creatures, right? And so I can't make the wrong assumptions about what kind of ends a God would have that really depend on atheism. So likewise here, while it seems conceivable, you know, because here we are theorizing, you know, we're unsure if we're just doing philosophy. We're unsure which of these possibilities, schemas are right. It can look like that would be, you know, different things would get explained if that were so. But if that's not the way necessary being is, then that's not even so much as possible. That's the crucial thing. And necessary beings are not brute beings. When you posit necessity, you're saying this is absolutely the way things have to be, right? So there couldn't have been reality like that. It just seems that there could have been, but in fact, no. It's like trying to imagine a world where you say, okay, suppose 2 + 2 = 10. You know, and you should balk. You should say, wait a minute, it just can't be that 2 + 2 = 10. You're not telling a coherent story. Well, there we feel like we can see it, right? Or at least we think we intuit elementary arithmetical truths, right? Well, we don't intuit in that way God's nature. Aquinas said that, you know, if we could really see the divine essence transparently, nakedly, as it were, we would see that God absolutely must be. And so that all kinds of notions of realities where there is no God, so they would just seem like worlds with square circles. I mean, these are just incoherent stories, right? We don't see it that way, and so it can look that way to us. Yeah. So, I mean, just one last spin on this. Sorry, I'm kind of blathering on. But, you know, if you ever hear the ontological argument, the ontological argument says, you know, if God is so much as possible, then he must be, and if he must be, then he actually is. It's kind of a neat philosophical trick, right? You know, Anselm says, well, even the fool, echoing the psalmist, says in his heart that there is no God, right? Well, okay, if the fool says that, he must at least understand the idea of God. He must have the notion of God. Well, if the fool reflects on the notion of God, then he sees that God is a maximally perfect being. That's what we mean by God in some sense, right? In Anselm's phrase, that than which none greater can be conceived, right? But a being that exists is better than, well, one version of Anselm's not so good. He says, well, a being that exists as well as having all these other features is better than a being that has all these great making features but doesn't exist, all right? So if you're really imagining God, you're imagining an existing being. So God exists. All right, that's not the best way. The better way of putting Anselm's argument, which he actually follows up in when a monk who believes in God objects to this reasoning, he says, well, look, God would be a necessary being, right? And if you allow that it's even possible that God exists, then I can show you that God actually exists, right? Why? Because God is a necessary being. So if you go off to this possible world over here, right, call it delta, and we suppose, okay, there's God. Well, what are you supposing over there? Necessary being. What does that mean? Being that exists in all possible worlds. Oops, slingshot. You know, so that means God inhabits all of possibility space, including our world, which is one of the possibilities. So if God is possible, he's necessary. Likewise, if he doesn't actually exist, then he couldn't possibly exist, right? Because he's a necessary. If it's right to think of God as a necessary being, he either exists in all possibilities or none of them, You can't have it. You can't say he exists in some possible realities, not others. Likewise, with this hypothesis of the necessary being as some kind of deterministic, mechanistic cause. Either that thing exists in all possible realities or none of them. So if it doesn't exist in the actual world, it's not even a possibility. I don't know. Hopefully a lot of you were able to follow all that. Yeah. I don't know if there was someone, I didn't see any other hands as yet, so yeah.
So you mentioned 2 + 2 is 10, or 2 + 2 is 4. And that seems like something that's necessary.
Right.
That's whatever that is, it's out there somewhere.
Yeah.
Where does that go?
Good.
And you probably said answer this in the book.
No. Well, yeah, I did try to talk about this a little bit, because this gets back to this question of if there are these principles that kind of govern the way God operates, you kind of worry that, well, then there's some kind of independent God kind of consults the principles for how he should behave or something like that. And that seems wrong, right? It seems to compromise what theologians call God's aseity, his absolute, independence of all else, right? Leibniz, right? I've said some things criticizing Leibniz, great philosopher that he was, but Leibniz Augustine says, seems to toy with a similar idea, says, right, we don't want to say that, right? But we do want to say there are sort of necessary truths. We don't want to say it just happens to be that 2 + 2 = 4. So we've got to somehow bring those necessities within the divine nature. Now, this is a rather obscure idea, but the idea at root is supposed to be that all these kind of necessities that we can transparently see, principles of non-contradiction in logic, simple mathematical necessities, somehow they don't reflect some independent Platonic realm of necessary truths, right? Plato's forms and mathematical reality that's somehow something independent of God that God just has to put up with, right? God says, okay, what kind of world do I want? Well, it's already all populated with all these Platonic, necessarily existing forms. Okay, I can't do anything about that, but I can at least decide what kind of contingent beings, but they got to be consistent with these necessities. That seems like that shouldn't be right? And the idea is to bring the necessity within the divine nature somehow. How is an interesting question, and it's rather difficult, but one idea that Leibniz has is to say the necessary truths are divine ideas. They are thoughts that God necessarily thinks by virtue of his very nature. Okay. And so while to us, right, we have this, you say, what is it when we see a mathematical truth after all? It's just we have this deep conviction that it's true and has to be otherwise, right? That's all. We don't have some kind of mystical kind of ability to reach out into a Platonic heaven or into the mind of God or something directly and kind of examine the content, right? We just, we're taught to kind of manipulate beads and I think after a while it just comes to seem obvious to us, and not just obvious that it is so, but that it has to be so, right? But what the nature of those facts are that we see that seem so evident to us, that's up for grabs, right? And on this picture, right, we simplify our picture of reality. Here's a virtue, right? If this idea can be made to work, it has a great explanatory virtue, and we get rid of, non-denumerably infinitely many independent entities called numbers, including the transfinite cardinals. If you know anything about infinity, there's more or less infinity, at least if Cantor's right. And then all these other abstract entities, properties and stuff. We could somehow reside all those within this one superabundant plenum nature, the nature of God. Right? Wow, we've done this huge simplification of our picture of reality. So there's theoretical reasons to like it too, because other things being equal, it's always nicer to kind of have fewer independent posits than otherwise. But this is just a kind of suggestion, and it's really hard to know how to take that suggestion. How do we really think about it? But anyway, it's an attractive idea for a theist. Lots of theists have been attracted to the idea that somehow necessities are not outside of God. They somehow reflect God's very own nature, or his activity in the case of Leibniz, his thinking activity. Yeah.
Yeah, with this mess with your explanation, you held that God could actualize. There's not just one greatest possible world, but there's a bunch of equally best possible worlds, and God he has certain desires, he just picks one. that mess with the explanation at all?
No, in fact, it's consistent with it. Right, so yeah, so if you think, you might think there can be an intrinsic limit to certain kinds of universes can only get so good. There's somehow you know, and I kind of briefly said, well, look, can't you always add more good things or something? But you might say, no, sometimes goodness is measured by balance, and there might be an equilibrium that constitutes perfect good. And this is how Leibniz thought about it. I won't go into the details, right? So, you know, it's not, I'm not saying it's an obviously dismissible idea that there could be the best universe of a given kind, right? But then you might say, but worlds that have completely different kinds of stuff might be, you know, really good, and you could get better and better versions of that. But you can't have this kind of good stuff and that kind of stuff together in the same world without at least mucking up the unity of the stuff, right? It's totally different natures. Your physics would be a mess. Leibniz wanted a really simple physics because, again, he wants everything beautiful, elegant, and so forth. So you could maybe have a best of type A and a best of type B and a best of type C, you know, et cetera. Then, this is starting to look better, because if there's a huge number of these basic world types, maybe an infinite number, now we could say God could just slice off the top on all of those, right? And now it's not, yeah, then he might go for that package. So the best creation, you might think, is to take the whole package of all the best on each scale of type of goodness. That's a possible way to go. But if you go that way, I mean, the one worry is it does turn out that it's inevitable then that you and I exist. We don't exist in all the possible worlds, all the possible universes, discrete universes, but it's inevitable because we're part of the best of one type of thing, right? You might worry about that. Where has contingency gone? But there is one out, right? Because while it might be inevitable that that a world of our type exists, it could be a world that involves indeterminism in the way it unfolds, like human free choices. So you might say, not all is, it might be, so it's inevitable that a universe of our broad type exists, right? But the details are not inevitable, right? Because we make choices, and maybe even at a fundamental physical level, there's indeterminacy there too. So that could be enough. So we preserve some measure of contingency, consistent with saying that this world type as a whole, it was inevitable there was going to be that, because God saw it as the best instance of its kind.
So
maybe that's a compromise.
You want to have it to where there's at least one world type where nothing exists, no human person other than God. That would be one world, and so that would be a part of it equally best, to where you can get out of, I think, Swinburne's considerations. You just keep on going up and up and up. That you don't need human persons anymore because it's just God existing, and so that doesn't add any. It need not make it a better world. It's just more people in it. You have one which is God existing.
Okay, good. Yeah, so here's I mean, this gets to a deep question, right? Because if God is infinitely good, right, just utterly, absolutely, you know, good in a metaphysical sense, the best kind of reality there could be, then why bother creating anything? The sum total of reality doesn't get any better. You know, infinity swallows up finite things getting added to it. It's just still infinite good. It's not. You haven't added. I know it sounds strange, right? Because usually, if you have a finite number of good things and you add a few more, you've got more good things. Well, no, if you've got an infinite amount of something, and you know what's infinity? Simple and countable infinity plus 25. It's countable infinity. Let's add a googolplex. It's the exact same, right? And so then you begin to say, wait a minute. What motivates God to create it all? It's not to make the total of reality better, because it can't get any better. Okay. The answer I like to this question is that it's part of God's nature to sort of graciously confer reality on things, finite creaturely goods. That is, if you think about it, goodness is, as there's a principle that medieval philosophers struggled with because they worried about the theological implications of it, but many of them talked about it, was this principle of the diffusiveness of goodness. Goodness by its very nature just gives rise to other good things. we talk about human beings as being more or less good or generous, right? Now, you take somebody who's a really generous human being, you stick them on a desert island all alone, they're not going to be able to manifest their generosity, right? But if you take that same individual, plop them down in the middle of an urban city with a lot of need, right? If they don't do anything, we then question the claim that they really are good, right? Because look, they've got opportunity to manifest that supposed goodness, and they're doing nothing, right? So likewise, God, right? He has the opportunity to just graciously confer reality. It's not because he needs it. God is self-sufficient, right? But it's a kind of act of pure generosity to give rise to other things. So it's not that the sum total of reality gets better. Created reality. That's why I think when we're talking about measuring goodness, we're kind of abstracting away from God, because God swallows up. Everything becomes infinitely good. But we're talking about the goodness of the created reality, right? Kind of like when an artist, a sculptor, creates a work of art. The sculptor's not taking into account his own value or her own value and saying, okay, what I want is a reality of my value plus something else. No, I'm just focused on the object, saying how good of a thing can I make that? And so similarly, God, even though reality is not in aggregate going to be any better, still, how good of a created thing can I do? And I do that out of pure generosity, right? Because it's good for us to be alive. We're all thankful for that, right? So that's, we weren't pre-existing, so it wasn't like God said, there was him, and I'll be good to him. So that's a difference from the case of human generosity, but he knows that in so creating sentient beings, there will come to be beings that experience great goodness, and that's a great good to them. And so that's, I think, the motive. It's an outward directed motive, not any benefit to God.